Welcome, everybody. Again, I'm Peter Casserella, Executive Director of Fons Vitae. It's a great pleasure to have you all here for this event. So without further ado, I'd just like to begin by recalling that Pope Francis, in his address on June 14th, 2024, reminded us that artificial intelligence is, quote, an exciting and fearsome tool. Actually, if you watch the live, he spoke in Italian, and so Mr. Biden, Macron, Ms. Meloni, Trudeau heard it translated in their earphones, but what he actually said is, uno strumento affascinante e tremendo, which I think is relevant because what he was trying to communicate, something might have been lost in translation is what I'm suggesting, what he was trying to communicate is that AI draws us into its sphere and changes us for good or ill, sometimes unwittingly, and by the same token, it unleashes new powers that bring about closer communication and potentially also the betterment of humanity. How will we use this tool in the future? How will we be changed by its fearsome powers? These are the questions that bring us together this evening. We come from divergent backgrounds and multiple fields of scientific inquiry, all seeking answers to these vital questions. We come from data management and from the analysis of the wisdom literature of sacred scripture. AI is a moment to reflect. We might ask ourselves in the midst of this embarrassment of riches, do we have the lens anymore to look at the book of nature standing before us and the book of scripture with a single integrated gaze? Now, more specifically, this event this evening came about through the collaborative work at Duke University that deliberately crosses disciplinary boundaries. My colleague, Dr. Michael Pencina, head of AI Health at Duke Hospital, came to me about a year ago asking for some form of collaboration with our new Catholic initiative, Fons Vitae. Also, as a result of that initial inquiry and what followed in the later months, we have 15 graduate students from across the country studying this week AI ethics with myself and Dr. Paul Scheritz, who's soon going to the University of Notre Dame. So we welcome these participants who are in attendance here tonight. The support for the summer seminar and for the live stream and recording of this evening's event is made possible by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. This grant created a creative partnership of Catholic initiatives at schools like Harvard, Cornell, USC, etc. And this is known as the In Lumine network, a network that promotes dialogue between science and religion. And the Lumen Christi Institute, which is represented here by Peter Tierney in the back of the room, Dr. Peter Tierney, is the founding member of that partnership and was vital in this collaboration. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Dr. Reinhard Hutter, visiting professor of Catholic theology at Duke Divinity School and co-founder of the Fons Vitae initiative that's housed at Duke Divinity School, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
It is a special joy and honor for me to introduce our speaker for this evening. At the university, the best introduction to a professor comes from the students. On Rate My Professor, one may read the following. Quote, Professor Pfau is arguably the most intelligent and passionate professor on campus. End of quote. This carries pretty far, I would think, and hence not much needs to be added besides my own conviction that Thomas Pfau is the last Renaissance person and genuine Geisteswissenschaftler I happen to know and have the privilege to call a personal friend. Thomas Pfau is the Alice Mary Baldwin Professor of English at Duke. He also holds a secondary appointment as Professor of Historical Theology at Duke Divinity School. He has published some 50 essays on literary, philosophical, and theological subjects, ranging from the 18th through the early 20th century. In addition to 2 translations of Hölderlin and Schelling, he has edited 7 essay collections and special journal issues. Professor Pfau is the author of 4 monographs, most recently of an opus magnum in 2 large volumes, Minding the Modern, Intellectual Traditions, Human Agency, and Responsible Knowledge, 2013, and Incomprehensible Certainty, Metaphysics and Hermeneutics of the Image, 2022. I highly recommend a close reading of Minding the Modern, a brilliant study that forms the backdrop of this evening's lecture. In Minding the Modern, Thomas Pfau argues that the loss of foundational concepts in classical and medieval philosophy caused a fateful separation between reason and will in European thought. Professor Pfau traces the evolution and eventual deterioration of key concepts of human agency, will, person, judgment, and action, from antiquity through scholasticism and on to the 18th century. He argues persuasively that beginning with the rise of theological and eventually secular voluntarism, modern thought appears increasingly reluctant and in time unable to engage the deep history of its own underlying conceptions, thus leaving our understanding of the nature and function of humanistic inquiry increasingly frayed and incoherent. One consequence of this shift is to leave the moral self-expression of intellectual elites and ordinary citizens alike stunted, which in turn has fueled the widespread notion that moral and ethical concerns are but a special branch of inquiry, largely determined by opinion rather than dialogical reasoning, judgment, and practice. It is within the horizon of this deep analysis of the modern predicament that Professor Pfau is addressing us this evening on the challenge of artificial intelligence in relationship to the human person. Please help me to welcome Professor Pfau.
Many thanks, Reinhard, for this generous introduction. I feel more than ever now that I'm part of a dying breed, the last humanist. And many thanks to the Fons Vitae organization for putting this event together and for inviting me. The lecture should run about 45 minutes, and so without further ado, I will launch right into it. My remarks this evening aim to sketch 2 ways of thinking about AI in relation to the human person. The first one considers AI within the long history of what Aristotle calls techne, which has always been aimed at the total of nature. The second perspective is normative metaphysical in kind and evaluates AI's potential impact. Considering how the pervasive use of artificial intelligence in everyday practice is likely to impinge on the experience of hope, love, joy, and memory, both at the level of the individual and the community. Undergirding this view is a distinctly Catholic conception of the human person, namely as teleologically ordered toward a summum bonum that transcends all contingent values and goods to which finite human beings find themselves intermittently attached. In the event, the dramatic rise of AI throws into sharp relief a decision towards which the history of techne has been building all along. Either human beings will acknowledge with all due humility that in spite of their moral and intellectual deficiency, they are and remain teleologically ordered towards a highest good beyond all private conceiving and willing. Or, conversely, they will acquiesce, as we currently appear poised to do, in their own de facto abolition and in being supplanted by some spurious transhumanist utopia. Let me add further that the stark antinomy with which AI now confronts us, and whose contours I hope to delineate more firmly in a moment, is not some passing contingency or challenge seemingly external to us. Rather, the dilemma of AI throws into unusually sharp relief our damaged and disordered post-lapsarian nature, of which Augustine, Pascal, Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and Simone Weil, among others, sought to remind their usually overconfident contemporaries. Indeed, were it not so that so often we find ourselves confronting our own nature's inherent misère, our constant susceptibility to distraction, moral and epistemic confusion, violent impulses, sexual anarchy, mindless greed, and much else, the seductive efficiencies of AI and the sterile perfection that it promises would hardly hold the pervasive appeal they currently enjoy. Hence, this being my overarching thesis, today more than ever, we find ourselves at a crossroads, either to answer an essentially metaphysical summons, namely the loving cultivation of the gift that abides within our damaged but still teleologically ordered nature, or alternatively to yield to the siren call of technologies promising to perfect human nature in ways that entail its de facto abolition and replacement by algorithmic and genetic counterfeits. In the latter case, the road allegedly leading up toward the human person's algorithmic and genetic perfection will prove to be the same as the downward path of an anti-metaphysical, reductionist, and ultimately nihilistic transhumanism that is bound to foreclose on the category of the human altogether. Now, as I already hinted, what holds true for most technological innovations also holds true for AI. We can properly understand it and take the measure of its implications only if we learn to resist its noisy, self-congratulatory jargon of the revolutionary and the unprecedented. Instead, we must situate AI within a long narrative arc that traces how what Aristotle calls techne has, over the course of millennia, crucially shaped the human project. In sketching a story that might be entitled Conjectural End of Human History, I'll alternate between a descriptive language of philosophical anthropology and a normative and essentially metaphysical outlook. Guided by Nietzsche and Augustine respectively, I will consider AI as a symptom within humankind's long-standing relation to techne, that vast inventory of tool-based practices whereby our species alternately fashions and undoes itself. Only within this larger penumbra can we hope to address some of AI's likely long-term effects, vacillating as they do between the convenient and the corrosive, the exhilarating and the terminal. Let's begin by recalling Nietzsche's well-known characterization of the human being as the, quote, not yet determined animal, das noch nicht festgestellte Tier, which is usually, though it turns out rather one-sidedly, understood as highlighting the human species' basic indeterminacy. Following Nietzsche, the anthropologist Arnold Gehlen remarked on how human nature is by definition not fitted into any specific biotope. We are, as he calls it, umweltbefreit. How we lack the kind of instinctual guidance found in animal organisms, and how consequently humans are caught up in a perpetual quest for reducing the numberless contingencies of their unstable life world. Indeed, the human being must every waking day once again generate from within those resources, both practical and theoretical, what will allow it to endure and perchance to flourish. There being, quote, no natural, organically fitted conditions of existence into which human beings might enter, and further considering that the natural and unadjusted conditions of existence often prove intolerable, as Gehlen puts it, human beings must continually evolve and refine those skills needed to survive in an ambient world that is never truly our species' organic home, but only ever an alien and contingent space, alternately perceived as a material obstacle or as a valuable resource. Nietzsche's and Galen's pragmatic account of the human being, according to which our default stance vis-à-vis the natural world is one of conquest and instrumentalization, brings me to my first speculative thesis, namely that AI constitutes a highly advanced and possibly final phase in the long history of our species, the culmination of an ongoing conquest of nature, integral to the species of Homo sapiens since its very beginnings, and which now proposes to replace organic nature with algorithmic counterfeits. Let me move on to the second thesis, which is less a separate claim than a different way of framing what has just been proposed. Thus, our existential situation appears just as volatile when we consider it from a stridently normative theological framework, such as that of Augustine and Pascal. For a strict Augustinian and normative view once again presents us with the same constitutive unease of post-lapsarian beings that Nietzsche had flagged, which is to say human beings estranged from nature qua creation and languishing in a state of constant affliction, the symptoms of which run the full gamut from boredom, anxiety, anger, and distraction, all the way to the boundless scientific curiosity and epistemic pride that have at last brought us to the present moment. Hence it is that T.S. Eliot's four quartets conceive nature as a volatile presence, forever hovering at the periphery of our consciousness, such as the quote-unquote brown god of the Mississippi River, dominating the poet's childhood imaginary. And I quote, sullen, untamed, and intractable, patient to some degree, at first recognized as a frontier, useful, untrustworthy as a conveyor of commerce. Then only a problem confronting the builder of bridges. The problem once solved, the brown god is almost forgotten by the dwellers in cities, ever, however, implacable, keeping his seasons and rages, destroyer, reminder of what men choose to forget, unhonored, unpropitiated by worshippers of the machine, but waiting, watching and waiting. In the form of deep-seated and constant anxiety, nature's otherness has in fact always been implanted within us, an integral feature of our own nature. Likewise, an alien deity, muddy and menacing, like Eliot's brown god, forever waiting and watching. If nature often registers within us as angst, it does so because our encounter with it reveals a persistent and vexing asymmetry between our reach and our grasp, between the limitlessness of our desires and the finite measure of our knowledge. Integral to our existential indeterminacy, then, is a deep-seated unease with the brute givenness and disconcerting otherness of nature, often experienced as a threat, begging containment by technologies that have been exponentially proliferating since the dawn of the industrial age. Very broadly speaking, we may identify three successive stages within this conjectural history. The first phase lasts from the beginning of Homo sapiens and involves fashioning primitive tools, discovering fire and harnessing the elements, soil and irrigation for agriculture, wind for transportation, grasses for livestock or roof covering, herbs for medicinal purposes. Though this phase does not conclude for good until the early 1800s, first indications of a major shift can in fact be found in the mid-1500s, when the default approach begins to shift from harnessing nature as given in its organic productions to consuming its raw materials for the purpose of engineering essentially unorganic contrivances of our own devising. Reflecting the replacement of wood and wind by steam and steel is a rhetorical shift, first observable around the mid-18th century, from nature as a divinely ordered reality or cosmos to the mere concept or idea of nature, such as famously promoted in Rousseau's sentimentalism and extending all the way to the pseudo-organic forms of late 19th century symbolism. This terminological shift, reflected in Romanticism's compulsive overuse of the word nature, betokens a more aggressive phase in our species' outlook on the natural world. Thus, as C.S. Lewis notes, in the wake of the Romantic era, quote, we are always conquering nature because nature is the name for what we have, to some extent, conquered. A particularly vivid account of this natural history of destruction is found in W.G. Sebald's 1996 book, The Rings of Saturn. In it, Sebald recalls how, quote, far more decisively than by soil composition or maritime climate, East Anglia's present-day melancholy aspect was shaped by, quote, a steady and advancing destruction over a period of many centuries, end quote. Starting in the late 16th century, a biotope that since times immemorial had featured oaks and elms spreading in unbroken waves across the gently undulating country, right down to the coast, was suddenly being consumed by systematic logging and burning. And as in East Anglia, so too, and here comes a longish quote, great fires were now lit on the other side of the ocean. It is not for nothing that Brazil owes its name to the French word for charcoal. Our spread over the earth was fueled by reducing the higher species of vegetation to charcoal, by incessantly burning whatever would burn, from the first smoldering taper to the elegant lanterns whose lights reverberated around 18th century courtyards, and from the mild radiance of those lanterns to the unearthly glow of the sodium lamps that line the Belgian motorways, it has all been combustion. Combustion is the hidden principle behind every artifact we create, like our bodies and like our desires. The machines we have devised are possessed of a heart which is slowly reduced to embers. Sebald's haunting eloquence reminds us that the conquest of nature during this second phase, which saw its wholesale conversion from a balanced order and a habitable dwelling into a monetizable resource and post-industrial wasteland, has been anything but residue-free. Instead, with the principle of combustion having steadily metastasized around the globe, with today 37 billion tons of CO2 being annually emitted into the atmosphere, Sebald's, quote, heart slowly reduced to embers, now confronts us in the form of ecological disaster and the impending societal collapse it forebodes. Still, until now, one final frontier has remained uncrossed, seemingly impervious to our species' quest for total dominion, namely our own nature. Which brings me to the third phase of my speculative history, the point when the combustion of by now evidently finite natural resources is being supplanted by a comprehensive re-engineering or simulation of formerly natural things. Taking the place of organic nature as a finite resource are its manufactured simulacra, artificially grown organs, 3D printing of prosthetic limbs, soil depleted of its mineral contents, now reconstituted with synthetic fertilizers that offer higher yields, but also kill microorganisms, genetically modified crops that allow, for example, tomatoes to ripen after harvesting, but also render our gut flora immune to antibiotics, lab-grown meat or cell-based food that reduces water consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, but is also laced with heavy metals, microplastics, carcinogens, and so forth. And of course, CRISPR-based editing of the human genome for a wide array of therapeutic and quote-unquote enhancement purposes, a process whose seemingly unlimited possibilities and dangers stands in inverse proportion to the current nearly total absence of any regulatory framework for its application. Let me now develop my third thesis, which concerns AI's algorithmic simulation of cognitive and emotive processes. Reports about AI inserting itself into new areas of our lives are by now almost a daily fixture on the news cycle. They include activities such as diverse as autonomous driving, medical diagnostics, speeding up drug discovery, performing robotic surgery, writing and checking computer code, document analysis, contract review, composing legal briefs, or predicting the odds of recidivism in legal decisions about parole, optimizing response time and analyzing movement patterns of individuals in urban policing, fraud detection, purchasing recommendations, dynamic price optimization, and customer segmentation in business. AI-operated killer drones, AI-based management of large financial holdings, rideshare optimization, or automatic digital editing of photos and videos, those skin blemishes on the face being airbrushed before the images ever meet the human eye. Add to that the integration of AI into everyday activities, such as smart composition, completing sentences just begun. I'm not sure how smart that is, but grammar check, voice-to-text transcription, Google Lens or car crash detection and emergency services activation, algorithmic mapping of the most efficient route for the EMT services or pizza delivery, the translation software, smart speakers, and so much more. Though hardly exhaustive, the list illustrates how over the past decade or so, our individual and collective reliance on AI has clearly grown exponentially. Let me stress, too, that the more critical musings to which I will now turn should not be mistaken as a nostalgic longing for a return to a status ante quo. While that might well be our preference, such a return is not even remotely conceivable. Still, as with any technology ever invented, from a primitive hammer dating back 3.3 million years ago in Lake Turkana, Kenya, good for breaking up rocks, also good for bashing in your neighbor's skull, all the way to nuclear fission and now AI and CRISPR gene editing, the salutary and the nefarious aspects of technology have always been intertwined. Such is to be expected, given the constitutive ambivalence, or in Augustinian and Pascalian terms, the morally lapsed and intellectually disordered nature of the humanoids who bring such things into being. That said, AI and CRISPR gene editing may well constitute a watershed moment in human history, throwing, as they do, into acute relief what Pascal means by grandeur et misère de l'homme. For by effectively replacing our given nature with algorithmic and genetic counterfeits, these technologies have led us to a point of no return, beyond which these technologies may well end up swallowing their maker. Let me now try to highlight some of AI's already observable corrosive impact on human flourishing, while giving particular attention to the pivotal function of memory within a teleological conception of the human person, and further, hazarding some speculation about the consequences of that faculty's continued atrophying. Here it is important to note that both in its operative structure and in its phenomenology, how we experience its operation, human memory is entwined with several other key concepts, among them personhood, dialogue, community, and a wide spectrum of inner states associated with the experience, most particularly joy, hope, and love. All of these, I maintain, will be decisively jeopardized by AI's continued rise to dominance. Now, ever since the emergence of writing and reading in Mesopotamia, memory and associated mnemonic technologies have proven integral to human flourishing. A major premise of my reflections, then, is that the pursuit of knowledge, grounded as it is in complex memory functions and realized in dialogical form, is the very telos toward which our species is ordered, both constitutionally and metaphysically. For while indeterminacy is undeniably our existential predicament, as Augustinians such as Pascal and existentialists such as Nietzsche and Heidegger contend, our species' ecologically and ethically checkered history to date also shows that this misère cannot be remedied by an unchecked conquest of nature and its consequent decreation. For any epistemic quest for dominion over nature, which now seems poised to issue in its whole algorithmic and genetic counterfeiting, is bound to consume the very beings whom it purports to benefit, namely us. Or, as C.S. Lewis puts it, each new power won by man is a power over man as well. Each advance leaves him weaker as well as stronger, end quote. Hence, some 2,500 years of tragic narrative from Homer and Sophocles via Augustine and Dante to Dostoevsky and Eliot, and above all in the Gospels, can leave little doubt that a process exclusively fueled by a desire but devoid of hope cannot attain any true good. For by its nature, such a quest progressively blinds us to the very outlines of the Platonic good, and thus forecloses on the very possibility of its realization. For all its bright and shiny novelty, or rather because of it, AI is poised to confirm this essentially tragic pattern. Still, however tragic, the pattern in question must not be construed as an instance of Homeric fate or necessity. For Nietzsche's claim, quoted earlier, that the human being remains morally and epistemically still undetermined, noch nicht festgestellt, is never just a brute fact. For the human being not only recognizes its own indeterminacy as an existential fact, but also as a potential opportunity. Thus, even as we are but a fragile thinking reed, un roseau pensant, as Pascal puts it, it is also true that our entire dignity consists in thought, which provides for the possibility that our existential condition may be transformed precisely by our knowledge of it. Indeed, our greatness, writes Pascal, consists in knowing, connaître, that we are wretched, as Pascal crucially points out. To know is never just a matter of computational efficiency or propositional cogency. For knowing also entails having achieved a measure of reflective distance vis-à-vis the knowledge so claimed. Put differently, human knowledge is always more than the sum of its raw contents. It not only bestows meaning on the world of phenomena before us, but also beckons us, the knower, to contemplate the deeper significance of these intellectual acts. What we may call a fundamental shift in our attitude from meaning, Sinn, to contemplation, Besinnung, amounts to a meta-reflection. To think, therefore, also means remembering and reimagining the discrete elements comprised by our noetic acts, and to do so in a way that may well transform the agent of knowledge herself. Human cognition thus exhibits a characteristically bifocal view that not only involves the correspondence between thing and mind, but also a second-order reflection on the as yet undetermined telos towards served by the noetic act, the act of knowledge itself. It is here, then, that Nietzsche's noch nicht festgestellt, not yet determined, reveals a different layer of meaning, not the predicament of our sheer indeterminacy, but the hope-infused appeal of something provisional, a higher end, for the sake of which human beings strive to remember, rework, reimagine, and recast the very things they claim to know. Inasmuch as we seek knowledge, less to satisfy our ephemeral appetites and curiosity about a given object, than to strive towards a good beyond the noema itself, we also come to experience ourselves as capable of a certain kind of flourishing. All this, then, is to restate what philosophy from Plato's Meno to Hegel's dialectic of intention and internalization, meinen, erinnern, had repeatedly argued, namely, that the structure of knowledge is inseparable from the inherently creative and dynamic operation of memory, a point most richly developed in Book 10 of Augustine's Confessions. Focusing on both memory's operative structure and on how it registers in experience, Augustine there demonstrates the infinitely subtle ways in which the operation of memory is entwined with our very being. To be sure, quote, the plains and broad palaces of memory, as he calls them, can also be understood as a storehouse of sorts, an impressive faculty for storing and retrieving information. Yet closer inspection reveals that what our memory contains are not things, but, quote, countless images brought from the things of all kinds that the senses perceive. The difference is crucial. For unlike things, the images contained in this vast archive of memory, of all that we ever contemplate, are ceaselessly recombined in reflective and creative thought. Thus, in this great hall of memory, I take various images and weaving them together with what is past, I envisage actions, consequences, and hopes that are to come, writes Augustine. Far from being ephemeral and fading echoes of things, the images born in my memory attest to their reality and enduring presence. To put it differently, the image stored in memory is not an inert facsimile of its original. Rather, it functions as a medium, uniquely capable of preserving and strengthening the original's potency. In what seems at first glance a contradiction of his earlier claims, namely that what we have in memory are not things but images of things, Augustine now insists, nor is it images I carry, but the things themselves. The paradox is resolved once we understand that the things now are remembered entities, things known in and through the medium of the image, and consequently imbued with almost limitless plasticity and potential. Included in this inexhaustible inventory held in memory are, writes Augustine, all the elements of the liberal arts that I have acquired and not yet forgotten. I like that qualification, and not yet forgotten. The nature of literature, the art of disputation, how many types of question there are, whatever I know of these is in my memory. I retain an image, having left the thing itself outside, end quote. This process is not conscious or deliberate, but on the contrary, overwhelmingly unconscious. Thus, while musing on, quote, whence and by what route things entered my memory, Augustine finds them to be always already there. They were there before I learned them, he writes, from which follows what I take to be Augustine's most far-reaching claim, and here comes a slightly longer quote. We find that learning those things whose images we do not imbibe through our senses, but perceive inwardly through themselves, as they are, without images, is nothing other than by means of thought and reflection to gather together and to arrange the things that are indeed contained within the memory, but which lie far and wide in no set order. I must drive them together again to make them knowable. That is to say, I must herd them together from where they are scattered. Hence the verb to think, cogito, and to herd, kogo, are related, as are to act, ago, to shake up, agito, and to do, facio, and to repeat, factitio. For Augustine, the scope of memory is coextensive with mental functioning altogether. For not only things, but all my states of mind are contained in my memory, he writes. Not, to be sure, as the mind had them at the time when it experienced them, but in another, far different manner. Memory, Augustine insists, enables us to progress from suffering various affective states, sadness, gladness, pain, joy, to developing a considered perspective on them. In memory-based reflection, we process these states, thereby freeing ourselves from being trapped and consumed by them, in ways that reveal Augustine's occasional proximity to the Stoics. As he puts it, quote, memory then is like a stomach to the mind. At the same time, echoing Plato's Meno, Augustine also finds cognition inextricably entwined with recognition. For the entire structure of our language and the very possibility of intelligible predication pivots on our grasping the difference between an experience and its conception. Quote, I can speak the words physical pain, but as long as I'm not in pain, it is not present with me. Yet were its image not in my memory, I would not know what to say when, in the course of a disputation, I distinguished it from pleasure. In what ways, then, do AI and social media possibly atrophy human memory-based cognition? Any response here ought to be guided by our basic existential situation, of which I spoke at the outset. That is, everything human beings empirically are, which is to be sure not all we are summoned to be, has been drawn from our not yet determined nature, which is to say, is the result of a continuous effort, there being no biotope into which our species is organically fitted. At the same time, it appears that human noesis, or cognition, cannot be reduced to conceptual mastery over the ambient world. For properly to know things in nature is not to supplant them with concepts and propositions, but to participate in them. The finding of human cognition, then, are not just its contents, but the fact that the knower is capable of developing a considered reflective outlook on the act of knowledge itself. Well beyond its operational dynamics, that is, thinking also means developing a perspective or stance, what Husserl calls Einstellung, vis-à-vis thought's immediate content, and indeed to have quite frequently second thoughts. And to do so is to reappraise the truth value of our propositions, not just relative to their object, but also in light of a greater good, for the sake of which we engage in theoretical and practical reasoning. Such a telos is never gratuitously posited by our will, nor does it randomly emerge from the fluctuations of the human thought process. In fact, we are dealing with two ontologically distinct orders here. Thus, all thinking and its reflective evaluation unfolds by definition within time, and as such are inherently memory-dependent processes. By contrast, the telos, or summum bonum, the highest good, for the sake of which we engage in reflective thought, and from which our intellectual acts derive their true significance, that highest good falls outside the order of time, belonging, as Plato had argued long ago, to the transcendent domain of the good and the true. Finally, then, I'm going to turn to some speculations where I hope to tarry a bit more with the deceptively simple fact that if by its very nature all human effort unfolds in time and thus is essentially bound up with the operation of memory, how that will be affected by the rise of AI. Now, the time-dependent or the inherently temporal constituency of thought processes not only holds true where we find ourselves engaged both affectively and analytically with texts or works of art, it also applies, say, to learning a foreign language. And all manner of processes defined by our infinitely varied modalities of attention, analysis, synthesis, patient reflection, creative expression, and logical argumentation. Suppose, for a first example then, suppose that a technology was to become available whereby the entire lexical and grammatical structure of a heretofore foreign language were to be downloaded into our brain in a matter of seconds. Precisely the efficiency of such a technological marvel would eo ipso deprive us of everything that goes into speaking and thinking well within a given language. Instead, we would suddenly find ourselves in possession of a resource without any telos for its use. For lacking would be those innumerable patterns of moral, social, and spiritual discernment, absent which socially pragmatic and effective language use is simply impossible. Where human beings are concerned, it should be obvious that such skills can only ever be acquired over time, with speakers patiently internalizing and creatively refashioning them in memory and dialogic practice. To speak a language is not to work with a formal definition of a dance, but in fact to be dancing with another human person, alternately leading and responding, seeking clarity by a host of different formal means, examples, metaphors, parables, irony, stories, humor, etc., and gently reminding one another of the overarching good for the sake of which we engage in dialogue with one another. Or, to offer one more example, consider what appears to be an increasingly common occurrence, a human being having a conversation, in quotation marks, with an AI system. Whatever the content of such an exchange, its most prominent feature is sure to be the affectless nature of the responses generated by the AI interlocutor. While the resulting exchange may formally resemble a conversation, the fact that one party operates algorithmically renders the event little more than a simulation of dialogue, a game of solitaire with words. For what transpires is simply more harvesting and recombining of information by AI and a dispassionate gaming of possible moves and countermoves. The human interlocutor will likely experience the exchange as a kind of sparring of sorts, a contest of cleverness, wittiness, or logical prowess. Wholly bereft of empathy, for there is no community here, and consequently incapable of generating joy in the human participant, the exchange instead ends up concealing, normalizing, or possibly compounding the human participant's existential isolation. In ordinary human life, we take it, after all, as a given that a conversation with another person has a rhythm, just as we notice that something is awry when there is no such rhythm, no music, no beauty, as Wallace Stevens calls it, no beauty of innuendo or inflection. In which case, we will have had the experience but missed the meaning, to quote Eliot. By contrast, interactions with AI and social media, where time either contracts to milliseconds or expands to the empty durée of the infinite scroll, revealed a de-rhythmization of modern life that first was remarked upon by Baudelaire. Precisely because an exchange with AI deprives us of any rhythmic and meaningful experience of time, it also cannot be affectively fulfilling, being incapable of generating joy or strengthening any sense of community. The result will be literally unmemorable, all the more so because the verbal transaction is likely to be saved and stored in some remote data storage center anyway. Try asking your teenage child to recall specifics of a chat with AI an hour earlier, and you will receive a blank stare. Insofar as our purely transactional exchanges with AI lack any telos beyond the immediate exchange of information or propositions, it will also preclude the formation of meaningful memories, which again only form a result of prolonged effort, as well as any sense of delight, empathy, or communal flourishing. To recall once more C.S. Lewis's observation, man's conquest of nature turns out, in the moment of its consummation, to be nature's conquest of man. The result of that final triumph of algorithmic processes over any time-bound quest for meaning reduces the so-called user of AI to a strictly epiphenomenal status. This user, then, is no longer a person capable of speaking, but a mere node within the system itself, for which he or she will, usually unthinkingly, provide further data, thereby enhancing its algorithmic prowess. By contrast, true learning is always a process, characterized by its own distinctive rhythms and unfolding over significant expanses of time. Seneca's insight, quote, "If ever you want to find out what a thing really is, entrust it to time," reminds us what we have intuitively always known, namely that learning cannot be reduced to the instantaneous acquisition or retrieval of information any more than truth can be reduced to ferreting out logical or computational errors, areas in which AI is admittedly very powerful. For as soon as we enter the domain of learning and inquiry proper, the domain that Pascal calls is governed by the esprit de finesse, the efficiencies of AI are bound to obscure or corrupt the true goal of learning, that being the flourishing of the learner herself. Before concluding, then, let me address at least one major objection that may well be raised, and I trust there will be others coming, that may well be raised in response to what I've said so far. Thus, some might argue that today's adolescents are liable to accept the incursion of AI into their everyday lives, neither with alarm, nor indeed with any clearly defined response at all. Instead, the presence of AI may seem entirely normal, an integral feature of their life world, a case of second nature, if you will. Already, children in middle school are beginning to replace their human friends with chatbots as conversational partners, and just over the horizon, there is the prospect of AI substituting for the human therapist, the private tutor, the life coach, or, as I was just informed this evening, the priest. Certainly, it would be a mistake to underestimate the ease and rapidity with which the young generation now coming of age is assimilating AI or assimilating to it. And much of what today's middle-aged demographic may consider alien, even dystopian, is already being accepted and often actively sought out as a normal feature of everyday social practice. However, just because something is not consciously experienced as a loss does not mean that the loss has not, in fact, been suffered. Indeed, without disputing the myriad ways in which AI so effortlessly insinuates itself into the life world of today's adolescents, there is ample reason to consider these developments dangerous. At the very top of a long list of such reasons is the fact that AI is metastasizing into the life world of the under 25 generation so quietly that those most susceptible to its appeal may never realize just how much their ability to distinguish the human from its counterfeit has already been atrophied. Nor, for that matter, may the generation properly register just how much its ability to feel love, friendship, joy, empathy, grief, and a variety of complex emotional states is as a result being diminished. For the cultivation of such responses is integral only to authentically interpersonal relations, where there is an implicit sense of reciprocal moral accountability, which is evidently not the case in human interactions with an AI. Likewise, to counter my claim that replacing a human person with an AI conversation partner normalizes and compounds our existential isolation by suggesting this isolation, however objectively real, may no longer be experienced as such, and therefore should not trouble us, does not hold water. For one thing, to embrace technological change merely because it demonstrably happens, in the manner of Alexander Pope's whatever is right, is to deprive human reflective thought of all counterfactual power, and to drain it of its two constituents, memory and imagination. Something peculiar, indeed bizarre, appears to be happening, where our dependency on AI has become so pervasive that an entire generation, ensconced and quasi-hypnotized in digital cocoons of its own making, fails to realize that it is about to be deprived of a vast spectrum of human emotional and reflective self-awareness. Thus, at least in effect, if not by design, the proliferation of AI in everyday life and practice is bound to contract the scope of human experience and attention to such practices and phenomena as can be algorithmically simulated. At the same time, much of what infuses our existence with meaning, not of a propositional, but of an experiential kind, can never be simulated. Inevitably, a life world overwhelmingly defined by AI deprives human beings of the myriad textures of life. The scent of a cherry tree in spring, the distant rumble of a summer cloudburst merging with the scent of fresh-cut grass, and the tickling sensation of its warm raindrops striking our skin. The autumnal sound of Canada geese vanishing over the horizon at dusk. The becalming silence and otherworldly glow of a snow-covered city. The lushness of the grape bursting against the palate, the soft embrace and endlessly changing facial expressions of a young infant, a spouse's knowing sidelong glance, and much, much more. In a world comprehensively misshapen by AI, there will be a dramatic loss of the myriad frequencies on which human beings until now have ordinarily been able to receive signals. No doubt, some of these phenomena can be simulated, at least visually and acoustically. But those who only encounter them in their algorithmic counterfeiting form will no longer understand the infinite richness with which these qualia are experienced in our three-dimensional life world. They will only know the counterfeit. Ultimately, the loss of texture of which I speak will end up erasing the ontological difference between mind and world, between an infinitely variegated and miraculously cohesive order, a cosmos, and a human embodied consciousness invited to participate in that order. Once the real has been supplanted by AI-engineered simulacra, human beings will more than ever look upon reality as something exclusively custom-made. Any sense of the world as a gift and as a source of infinite adventure and discovery will gradually fade and be supplanted by an image of reality as wholly predictable and an endlessly malleable resource, over which, having ostensibly made it, what once were human beings now exercise unlimited dominion. In the end, what we say about AI, how we appraise its potential and dangers, will shed less light on the ominous phenomenon itself than on the concept of the human person that tacitly underwrites how we view our very existence. In ways almost too obvious and too far-flung to warrant retelling, AI, and I believe also gene editing, ought to be viewed as the culmination of a centuries-old attempt at redescribing and gradually re-engineering the human being, an undertaking that, as I've tried to suggest, is itself part of a much longer project of securing total dominion over nature, and which, at long last, has now arrived at the final frontier, our own nature. Manifestly post-lapsarian in its endless internal divisions and disorder, our species' paradoxical condition once again shimmers through in this present dynamic, which finds humanity at once feverishly engaged in conquering its own nature, while at the same time anxiously brooding over the myriad consequences, some foreseeable and others as yet incalculable, that success in such an endeavor would likely entail. However things may turn out, this much at least is clear. Fueling our quest for total dominion over all of nature's abundant gifts has been a peculiarly skewed anti-metaphysical and a-teleological conception of freedom as the total emancipation from all transcendent givenness. Put differently, the reigning assumption all along has been that in conquering all of nature, our own included, we shall at last have shuffled off any residual transcendent norms. Now, should such a state of total control over our nature ever be reached, the post-human bipeds then roaming the earth will no longer be receptive to the wondrous otherness and inexhaustible riches of creation, and consequently will also have lost the gifts of gratitude and empathy on which human thinking, learning, and dialogue have always depended. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pfau. This vision you have given us is not only very eloquent, giving us food for thought after our meal, but it's also to the same degree in its poetry and its evocativeness arresting, because you gave us from the very outset a challenge to consider this metaphysical summons. And so you've set the bar very high, and I'm very, very grateful for that and thankful that we're able to begin with your presentation and your overwhelmingly powerful, evocative, and provocative words. Our goal this evening, as I said at the beginning, is to think about this exciting and fearsome tool, AI. And so to that end, we have a superb panel of respondents to continue our discussion of Dr. Pfau's stimulating, provocative paper. So I'll simply introduce our three respondents and then in the spirit of dialogue, allow you to continue the conversation. First, we'll hear from Dr. Michael Pencina, who, as you know, is the head of Duke AI Health. He's also Vice Dean for Data Science and Chief Data Scientist in the School of Medicine. He co-founded and co-chairs the Algorithm-Based Clinical Decision Support Oversight Committee and is co-director of Duke's Collaborative to Advance Clinical Health Equity. His 400 peer-reviewed publications have been cited over 111,000 times, at least according to ChatGPT this morning, He received a PhD in mathematics and statistics from Boston University in 2003 and a master's degree from the University of Warsaw, and he joined Duke's faculty in 2013. We're very happy to have you here, Dr. Pencina. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Matthew Elmore. Matthew Elmore is the AI Ethics and Evaluation Specialist at Duke AI Health. Dr. Elmore supports operations focusing on the ethics evaluation and oversight of AI-driven clinical decision tools. He also plays a major role in organizing work with the Coalition for Health AI. Dr. Elmore joined Duke AI Health after completing his work in bioethics in Duke's Divinity School, where he did a dissertation under Luke Bretherton on free will and the ethics of informed consent. And he comes to this field not only with publications in both public health and theology, but as a former EMT who worked in his hometown hospital in Michigan and brings that experience to bear on these very weighty reflections which he's taken up. Last, but by no means least, my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Norman Wirzba, is the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor of Christian Theology and Senior Fellow in the Keenan Institute of Ethics at Duke University. Dr. Wirzba is the Director of Research for the Office of Climate and Sustainability. Dr. Wirzba also helped us this past spring in the Fons Vitae Collis webinar, Feeding the Hungry, Caring for Creation. His books include Agrarian Spirit, Cultivating Faith, Community in the Land, This Sacred Life, Humanity's Place in a Wounded World, Food and Faith, A Theology of Eating, and my favorite, The Wendellberry Reader, which I'll never forget. So without further ado, we'll turn to our panelists. You can just stay where we are and respond.
I will start with thanking Dr. Pfau for this fantastic lecture. And I'm not doing it just to be polite. I very much believe in what I'm saying. And I'm sitting here thinking, I wish you delivered this lecture to us 30 years ago before the social media revolution. I think we are at a very unique and special time in human history, and people say it's the third or fourth technological revolution. This one is different, in my opinion, than the previous ones, in the sense that humans were at least as intelligent or more intelligent than what they invented, right? So if we go to the simple tools or the machines and everything else, human ingenuity was beyond what was created. Now we can argue that in some ways, and I understand that it's a kind of a narrow definition of intelligence, the tools that are being built with AI will be smarter than humans in this narrow definition, right? It's take diagnostic medicine, the ability to identify tumor early from an image based on AI likely does or will exceed what a single person can do. I will argue AI is ethically neutral, and I'll talk a little bit kind of on my views of AI. Human beings are, so we hope, ethically positive. So we are in a world where the less smart in some ways, yet ethical being needs to be in charge of the potentially smarter but ethically neutral creation. Okay, that has never happened, and that poses key challenges. I think going back, right, with the dawn of social media, they've brought some good things and some positives, but a lot of negatives. I think as you reflected, right, how teenagers communicate with each other would have been unimaginable even 30 years ago, and the unintended consequences and suffering it leads to on a kind of local and more global human beings are definitely there. So I think it's absolutely critical that we engage in deeper conversations along the lines that Dr. Pfau has outlined for us to maybe intervene or prepare, which I also agree, there is no return. the cat is out of the bag, right? We're not going back. We cannot pretend AI is not here. And I strongly believe the solution is not to say, oh, we're going to live our lives as if it didn't exist. That is not the right response. So what do we make of it, and how do we respond? So I will say I take a much more humble view of AI than my admittedly limited understanding of the fullness of Dr. Pfau's lecture, right? You said not to overhype what it is, and then you said, well, it might be the last chapter, right? That's a big deal. For me, the view I take, AI is a technology, right? When I was in elementary school, in the mathematics classroom, there was a big sign, mathematics is the queen of sciences. Right? I think this was kind of trying to say that it is a science and counts. So I view mathematics, and by extension AI, as very much part of the natural world, rather than this kind of superhuman, different alien thing. It's a tool that we will use. I also will argue, you said that kind of AI is quietly getting itself into everything that we do. That's absolutely true. I will say it's not really the AI, it's the humans that are injecting it, right? We are still the developers of AI. And the malfunctions of AI that I've seen, maybe on this deep of a level that you talk about, are usually a cause of human misuse of the tool, right? So I think it's for me, it's this more narrow view that gives me more hope of the applications. Because if we take the broader view, I fully agree with you that this is not good, right? If we let AI take over, replace the conversations, where start talking to bots and so on, that's a world that I entirely reject. And because I reject it, I take comfort that I don't have to live in it. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. So, and the challenges, again, to humanity are very real, to learning are very real. And I think important point in what you said is that process is important, right? Memory, learning, acquisition, and I agree with that. I ask a question, are all processes important, or are some more menial or less important as a process, and getting to the end without the process can be justified? And can we even take it to a new level and say, can AI increase our humanity? And so let me give an example. Earlier, for our workshop participants, we had a demonstration from a doctor who is using a scribe to record the conversation, to write a clinical note automatically, right, that they just review. So that's one of the kind of flagship uses of AI. It has multiple benefits. So the doctor can talk to the patient. How many of us go to the doctor and the doctor stares at the computer and types as they try to talk to us, right? This is an example where AI helps the doctor have a conversation with the patient, and that's what our doctor told us. It also adds a helpful level where it reduces the burden on them, right? They told us about the concept of doctor's pajama time, meaning how much time they spend at home catching up on the work they haven't done at work, rather than spending time with family or engaging in more higher level, more valuable, we can say, pursuits, than writing this note. That's an example of AI application, again, in a more narrow, humble way, that can bring something positive. So I think it's important to distinguish, and that brings me to my hierarchy of ethical and maybe more valuable application of AI. It starts with the premise that the human person is on top of the hierarchy, right? I think you made a very important point about us being a node in the system. And I agree that it's a problem. A lot of people talk about the concept human in the loop, right? I've written a paper and I reject that notion and say, human needs to be on top. We are in charge, and it's worth repeating and keeping it in perspective with this humble view of AI as a tool in the toolbox of human beings, that it's basically crafting nature for our bigger or better benefit, right? So we need to stay on top. If we start losing our agency, and I very much agree with you, the dangers that you outlined are present and real, and it will take a lot of work. You can argue maybe the work will be even more than not having the AI in the first place, but that's too late for that. So that doesn't change. With human on top, we get to decide what we use AI for, right? And that's extremely important. As I said, the examples that I've seen of AI-based algorithms malfunctioning happens because of human errors or the application of how they've been used. As long as we define, and that goes back to what I say about the process, which are the processes that we view as ethically acceptable to offload to AI, right? So it's a little bit of a balance or kind of golden middle, right? Not everything goes to AI, not everything remains as a status quo, but we have a thoughtful approach. I think we can find the right balance. Also, identifying the potential negative consequences, and I think your lecture is a great step in that very direction, which again, I think we missed as a humanity 30 years ago at the dawn of social media. If we identify and monitor the consequences, so very thoughtful approach, not the current hype, right? Everybody develops an AI tool in their garage and tries to sell it. I used an example earlier. The workshop participants, I was at a big health conference, and a CEO of a company came to me and said, I'm developing an AI tool using synthetic data. Do you have any real data that I can validate it on, right? So we basically have artificial intelligence being developed on artificial data, right? That's very artificial. So we have to identify and monitor the consequences, and that leads me to the fourth point. We need to have solid governance, right? It's again with human on top. If we have the governance, if we make the decisions where we're applying it for what purpose, and I'm very proud of in Duke Health we have what I joke the oldest AI governance system for AI in health. It's 3 years old. Right, that no new algorithm will be applied on the patients unless it goes through a review by an expert panel. So I think with that, I strongly believe AI can be useful, can be beneficial. That doesn't say there aren't dangers, more proximal or higher level dangers, and we need to be mindful of. But we humans can still stay in charge and shape our future. Thank you.
Let me echo Michael's thanks to you for a fantastic paper, Dr. Pfau. This is exactly the kind of conversation that we do not have in the realm of applied AI ethics, which is exactly why we need to have it. So I'm grateful for the chance to respond to your thoughts. Well, I hear Dr. Pfau describing two possible eventualities. Either humanity understands its nature as oriented toward the summum bonum, the highest good, God, in whom we live and move and have our being, or we defect from the true calling and delight of our nature, moving toward a transhumanist future in which there is apparently no God and no divine grace. Many would recognize that both options are, in a manner of speaking, stories of salvation. The first one, I think it's fair to say, is sacramental, right? It opens us to receiving the mystery of God's goodness, which heals us of moral disorder. And what I like about Dr. Pfau's approach is that the summum bonum is not ethereal, or at least not only ethereal. It saturates the world. It summons praise and wonder. I hear this pronounced in Dr. Pfau's lyrical writing about the sensations we can savor in each season of the year, you know, snow quietly draping a city, the bursting of a grape in your mouth. And an important point to draw out is that the language he uses actually can't finally capture these experiences of goodness. Dr. Pfau's lyricism instead opens us up to appreciate what surpasses any attempt to finally describe or codify nature. The second salvation story is the one he doesn't like. It involves rationalized, industrialized, digitized, and codified power over the natural world, leading ultimately to a future under our control. And I put "our" in scare quotes because we do not know what we will be in this future. Ray Kurzweil, a leading figure of the transhumanist movement, predicts a time when there will be no distinction, I'm quoting him here, there will be no distinction between human or machine or between physical and virtual reality, hence the term transhuman. Now, I'd like to point out that both of these stories offer a way to go beyond the merely human, a way that opens us up to what exceeds the limits of our nature's limited rational power, right? The first has the mystique of a poem evoking the incalculable, which is not to say the irrational. A good poem can open us up to a world of ordered goodness beyond our mere faculties of calculation. And if the first story has the mystique of a poem, the second has the mystique of an algorithm. It evokes a world finally subject to calculability. Nature may exceed our calculations at present, but we are merging with technologies that enhance our capacities and carry us beyond the limits of merely human cognition. So in the end, the transhumanist vision is hyper-rational, more than humanly rational, but bent on human power and control. So the dialectic here, if I can reduce it to a pair of terms, is between contemplation and computation. What is the difference between a poem and an algorithm? If we take each to reveal a distinct hemisphere of human consciousness, the two must cooperatively signify a whole sphere. Ian McGilchrist, the neuroscientist and philosopher, believes that the modern problem has always been one of priority. Which hemisphere obtains a better view of the real world? In the 1980s, Donna Haraway described the underpinning logic of our age as, quote, the translation of the world into a problem of coding, a search for a common language in which all resistance to instrumental control disappears and all heterogeneity can be submitted to disassembly, reassembly, investment, and exchange. Now, personally, it's hard for me to say that AI is ethically neutral, insofar as it offers a vision of total control, profit, codability, and efficiency. In Heidegger's words, we have learned to demand that nature be orderable as a system of information, so much data to be harvested and processed for our use. This is as true in modern biology as it is in the fields of data science and AI. Think again of CRISPR and the coding of genetics. All that is solid seems to melt into code. Now, when it comes to modern healthcare, my sense is that both narratives permeate the everyday practice of clinicians. It may be rare to find people who doggedly adhere to the metaphysical doctrine of the summum bonum, but it's also rare to find people who doggedly adhere to the transhumanist prophecy of our new nature and its coming kingdom. Instead, what we find is a mixture of impulses. On the one hand, many clinicians try to view every patient as a person who deserves to be heard in an open way that transcends the logic of coding, right? Somehow that human-to-human relationship of care ought to exceed the coded format of diagnostics, efficiency metrics, risk assessments, and billing. On the other hand, the buzzword in modern healthcare is evidence-based. Everything must be codified, made more efficient, devoid of risk, and subjected to cost-benefit assessments. Furthermore, the impulse to extend the life of the body, to bring it under rationalized control, has driven all sorts of novel interventions that entangle biology with technology and data. So, Dr. Pfau, I think, has done a remarkable job of extrapolating the historical tendencies behind both impulses. And his technique reminds me of Augustine's City of God, which narrates the outcome of two societies that live in the midst of each other. One ends in peace, pursuing the summum bonum. The other ends in destruction, pursuing the lust for power and control. Now, while Dr. Pfau issues a warning about the latter, I do wonder if he allows his worry to eclipse the hope of the former. In other words, I wonder if he tends to fear and thus believe the image of a future foreclosed from God's grace. But as a fellow Catholic, I also wonder if, along Augustine's lines, we can find a way forward. Augustine's epic about the city of God, its history and its future, was written as an allegorical reminder that the people of God have always been pilgrims exiled in Babylon. And there's a beautiful line from the prophet Isaiah, many of you know it, about how to be a citizen of Zion living in Babylon. It says, "Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare, you will find your welfare." Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare, you will find yours. Now, to me, as an AI ethicist, that means getting to know Babylonian tech. It means seeing what can be done here and now, together with people of various backgrounds and disciplines, to define the limits of technology and, in conscientious ways, direct it toward human flourishing and the common good. Now, just exactly how that plays out is another conversation, but critically, at no point should the endeavor impinge upon the contemplative life, the quiet, grateful reflection upon the true, the good, and the beautiful, the incalculable. The tension between control and contemplation is great, but I don't see that as a new problem. I see it as an old problem dressed differently. So in a manner of speaking, I agree with Dr. Pfau, but I believe we live in a mixed context, and we need to be cautious about sorting it out too quickly into black and white. Furthermore, those who desire the summum bonum are called to live in the mix, here and now, doing good by cultivating hope beyond the limits of finite reason. Despite feeling drawn to dystopian narratives, I have a great deal of hope that the story of salvation is still occurring precisely because the good is incalculable and inexhaustible. To quote Hopkins in his classic poem, God's Grandeur, "And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, O morning, at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings." Thank you.
Did you really have to end with a Hopkins poem? God,
That good or bad?
that was good, but oh man.
Says it better than I could.
So first of all, much gratitude, Tomas, for this fabulous paper. And what I want to say is bring to the table two streams of reflection. One that is anthropologically oriented, and the other in terms of the larger context in which AI is developing, which will have an economic and an ecological slant to those comments. And I should say also very clearly that I'm not opposed to all AI, right? But I want to raise some questions that I think evoke considerable concern in me, because I firmly believe that AI is not a tool, it's an ontology. And as an ontology, it shifts in fairly dramatic ways how we think about persons and how we think about world. And I want to sort of lift up some of those concerns that I have. And I also recognize that with, I have 45 minutes, is that? With 7 minutes, there's not going to be much nuance in this. So first of all, I think what I see in so much talk about AI is an assumption about what it is to be a human being. And it's a conception that is very much reliant upon a modern, atomized, individualistic conception of the person. And it's no surprise that this work is happening within a neoliberal framework, which to me is, of course, deeply concerning, because what it does is it renders the human being something which I think is deeply dishonest about who we are. And Tomas talked about some of these dimensions very beautifully, but I want to put them in slightly different terms, which is to say that I believe that what a human being is most fundamentally is to be a resonant being. And what I mean by a resonant being, and there's multiple levels upon which we could describe how resonance works itself out in a human body and in a human affective dimension. But resonance registers, and I think most of you will know this experience, I hope you do. It is when you encounter your beloved for the first time and you are simply knocked off your feet. This is not an encounter that you could describe in any way as being a mechanical encounter, where some object meets another object, comes into contact with another object. What happens in the encounter is something that we would call a profound transformation of you, right? You're breathless, your heart is going really fast, you don't know, you lose all sense. Now, what is it about that experience? It's not just an experience that we have with a particular beloved, but those kinds of things happen all the time. Think about the acoustical phenomenon that is sort of the basic metaphor we might use for resonance. One tuning fork sounds, a neighboring tuning fork will spontaneously vibrate in response to it. Our bodies are that, right? Think about a newborn infant, how touch is absolutely crucial to its own development. Physiologically, think about the phenomenon of taste, what taste does to a body, and what it does not just to the body, but to our whole being. Right? We are resonant beings, which means we can never be reduced to mechanical function. And so much of the AI language that I encounter seems to be operating on a very mechanical conception of what connections might be, right? They're voluntary, they're episodic, when in fact we know that deep relationships are never voluntary or simply episodic, right? And the best example of this would be, you know, when you think about mechanical coming together, take your Lego pieces, right? You can put them together, take them apart, all that sort of stuff. But our life isn't like that. And I love Tomas's reference to the stomach of the mind, memory. Think about the real stomach. When you cook something and you put your ingredients together, try taking them apart. Can't be done, because that's exactly how the world is. The world is one vast kitchen of life in which we are constantly digesting, ingesting. And this is the character of our relationships. It's not mechanical. It's deeply resonant and also deeply sympathetic, right? So that in our relationships, we never can simply walk away because we retain the memory of the other that we've been in relationship with. And they're working themselves out in us in profound ways. And what I find in AI that's missing is this sense that human beings, we're not ever simply transactional beings. We're covenantal beings. And the question is, how does this change the way we think about who we are and our responsibilities, not just for each other, but for the world around us, when we do think about human beings in transactional terms? And I want to specify this transactional character a bit more now, because I think the question of control, you know, shows up in Tomas's paper multiple times. I think what we're seeing in the realm of AI and transhumanist discourses more generally is now simply the extension of what we saw happening. I mean, historically goes back quite a long way, but it becomes particularly intense with the onset of mercantile capitalism, and then certainly in industrial capitalism, which is to say the exercise of control of the world. And I want to specify that because the control of the world that's being exercised here is the kind of control that begins first by making legible a world that is deeply mysterious, unmysterious. Or in Descartes' language, dead, right? Res extensa, simply extended stuff, right? So now the possibility exists to quantify it, to commodify it, to mine it, to sell it, and then ultimately to abandon it. Now, this is the exercise of control over the world that has been on vast display And now we're applying this very logic to the human being. And I don't think it's surprising that the many things that I've just mentioned about how we have rendered nature, creation, I would say, these are things that we're beginning to see in respect with people as well, that people are feeling themselves to be having been reduced of their mystery. There's none of that in a human person, that you're legible for now extraction. And some of this work has been beautifully described in this book called The Ordinal Society, written by, I can't remember, it's two authors. One of them is a French sociologist at Duke University here. Because what we see with this modern technology is that it has created a world in which quantification, classification, categorization, mining has been the ultimate aim. Oy. Just briefly now, well, no, I'll lead you to one more thing. There is a paradox at the heart of the transhumanists, and you alluded to this, Matt, which is that to relieve the human condition, we have to obliterate the human condition, which is a very bizarre thing to want to do. And what's at stake for me, and this is not something that Tomas talked about as much, but I know you would agree with this, is the loss of form. Form is a concept that is so vitally important because form allows us to talk about limit. And it's no question that the control of the world is about limitlessness. And the minute we don't pay attention to limits and say we can override all limits, we lose all possible bearing by which to make judgments about the character of the work that we do in the world. Right? If you are a limitless being, that means you're endlessly manipulable. We can never know when a manipulation is wrong or good. It's just manipulation. And I worry we're heading in that direction. Now, some of the larger context kinds of questions, right? And I've already briefly alluded to this. On the economic level, we cannot ignore the fact that this development, AI technological development, is happening within an economic context. So the question of who is the we controlling AI development? Who is that we? Right? I was talking I was mentioning earlier, I was at the University of Chicago talking with computer scientists who are working in these AI companies. And they have been told explicitly, there are no handrails. There are no limits. If it means disrupting democracy, that's fine, because the whole Silicon model is not simply about profitability. It's about disruption and destruction, which is to say, you eliminate the previous platform for doing business, right? So if you were Blockbuster and you had those videos or DVDs, Netflix comes along, obliterates it. If you used to drive a taxi, Uber comes along. Okay, I mean, we're just seeing these are the models of business that drive AI. And so who is the one controlling? I know right now lots of research and development is going into development. How much is going into regulation or risk analysis or safety? There is very little investment money that's going in that direction, and we're going to need it, absolutely. So we need to figure out how are we going to control something when the profit motive is enormous, right? That's a huge question. And then just a very brief comment about ecological context. There is no question that these technologies are energy hungry like you can't believe. And we're trying to figure out how we're going to reduce our need of fossil fuel consumption, right? Or battery production. I mean, solar and wind is not going to propel AI. And the question then becomes, are we going to choose between heating homes or running algorithms? That's going to be the choice, because I was just at a heat conference. The number of people who are suffering because they can't cool their homes is enormous. Whole millions, tens of millions of people are going to have to evacuate their homes because it's simply too hot to live there. And we're going to choose between algorithms or cooling. And I'll stop there.
So the table is set. We have deep and interesting difference of opinion about the nature of AI, neutral tool versus ontology, and also about fear and hope. What I'm going to propose is, since we do want to end at 8 p.m., is we'll take one or two comments from the audience here at WB Duke. If there's a question online, we can take that, and then we'll revert back to the panel and allow you to have the last word. So is there anyone who would like to begin. Dr. Schertz. We have a microphone, and if you want to just identify
Thank-
yourself, Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Pfau, for that brilliant talk, and to all the respondents. It really illuminated the different issues that are at play here. But I love the talk. I mean, I see it seems like it's an update of the abolition of man for the AI age, and that was something deeply influential for me, that essay. But I think what's in that essay is that Lewis wasn't just calling for despair or to reject the technology. He thought that we needed to educate our passions better in that essay, and also to submit technology to the normative power of nature. And in that sense, the abolition of man was a success in some ways. I see the CRISPR story as actually very hopeful, because in many ways, we have developed the therapy enhancement distinction, right? So everyone thinks, there's problems with it, but most people are calling for CRISPR and genetic engineering to be only used for therapy for disease, to restore nature, right? So it is something, I mean, there are transhumanists out there, but if you get into a regulatory framework, that's what people want. So I'm wondering, what is it that we need to call for to submit AI to the normative power of nature? I mean, I think your idea of your hermeneutic nature of memory, and what are the kinds of implementations that will kind of undermine that kind of hermeneutic nature of knowledge that we need to kind of remove. I mean, I think chatbots are something that you clearly say like removes the intersubjective nature. I think we can think about how ChatGPT has revealed how much we've been accepting university education as just information kind of dumps and poor writing. But I think there are hopes here if we can kind of develop some kind of ideas for where is AI kind of doing this kind of total control of nature. I mean, I think the utter failure of virtual reality and the metaverse, no matter what corporations want to do, is a very hopeful sign in this. And where can we use it, right, in which it will be submitted to nature in that way?
Yes. Over the decades, I've been here now 42 years, but I grew up in Europe. I've always noticed that there's the kind of eagerness to end conversations on topics, however agonizing, on a hopeful note. And and I have, perhaps it's a kind of melancholy European me that never quite felt as urged to accomplish that. So let me offer a couple of reflections right away. The first is Lewis's account. You're right to see the connection, but I would also say that Lewis, of course, was speaking in reference to a completely different paradigm of what technology is. There was really no serious suggestion then, nor does he claim that there was, that technology would, in a sense, swallow up its maker. Although there is a moment late in the text where he does say, but if that point was ever reached, then in fact we would inhabit a thoroughly dystopian world in which the category of the human would then in fact disappear. And so clearly he saw at least enough perhaps also in our sort of relentless drive towards technological advances to sort of extrapolate that possible scenario. And he, I think, quite rightly realized that at that point, it would not just be that technology would sort of create ecological devastation, which would have been harder to forecast, but human devastation. Now, I want to sort of weave into that. It's been pointed out very rightly by Norman Wirzba that we have not really talked much about the economics. But what I see right now is a kind of perfect storm of Western liberal democracies clearly on the ropes. It's generally suffering from weak, divided, and often intellectually very weak forms of governance. At a moment where for-profit enterprises see immense potential for disruption. And the hope the narrative of hope with which I would like to think it's true, but I have increasingly difficulty doing so, is that we can still get a regulatory purchase on it all. I think that our political institutions are not fit for purpose to meet a challenge of this exponential scale and danger. And so the hope for some kind of regulatory master plan that reins it all in strikes me as utopian more than hopeful. And that's, I think, one of the greatest dangers. The idea, I mean, what you essentially refer to was that in many ways, the principle that economically, the economic principle behind technological progress has been for a long time what Schumpeter calls creative destruction. And that has, in a way, now reached a kind of maximal intensity as far as I can see. And given how the confluence of economic interests in political decision-making processes, I think it is actually excessively romantic to hope for a regulatory framework that will rein in this process. I will give one example, which brought to me by your remarks, Dr. Pencina, about medical assistance and the fact that, as we now all know, doctors type into computers rather than look at us when we have meetings with them. I find that still disconcerting. I see two reasons for it. One is that, of course, if efficiency is a tremendous force, the amount of time that the doctor can spend with a patient is in many ways governed by insurance requirements. And the other one is, I guess, the always looming specter of possible litigation. So you need to have enough contact to make sure you haven't done any obvious harm, or any that can at least legally be pursued. And at the same time, you need to get through this particular encounter as fast as possible. In many ways, my Seneca quote comes again to mind. If you want to know what a thing is, give it time. The first pediatrician who we saw when our first daughter was born said, if I give a young child a neurological exam, all I have to do is ask them, as I have to do anyway, to undress, and I watch as they undress. Then I know where neurologically things are at. But of course, if the doctor types into a computer and doesn't look at the patient, that is lost. I also wonder to what extent the recall, in a way that is simply constrained by what the computer will on a future encounter deliver, rather than on what the doctor had seen if he had looked, is also limited. So I keep thinking that in many ways, what we really have to ask ourselves in the end is whether we have not already, to a disproportionate degree, accorded much too much space to considerations of efficiency and far too little to the intangible, but nevertheless palpable value of human encounters, in which we look at each other and so forth. Taste was a perfect example, by the way. You can, of course, cook a beautiful meal, but how much will you savor it if you eat it in front of a computer screen? I mean, the question again arises, there is a kind of sacramental dimension to it, but you actually have to be present to it. And so often that's no longer the case. So, I mean, our sensorium can also be degraded to the extent that we are living as it were in a state of perpetual, as Pascal would call it, égarement, perpetual distraction. Then our sensory capacity to receive textures, as I referred to, will greatly atrophy. And I think we have reached that point.
Thank you. I think there might be a Polish response to this European perspective. Before we go to that, I think there's something from the online community. Peter,
yes, sure. So Marco Albangaleas asks or says, with the challenge of influencing the secular world on making ethical decisions on how to develop and use AI technologies, there is a need of a common framework to discuss the decisions. The natural law framework is not accepted by all. Utilitarianism and the technocratic philosophies have permeated the markets and the innovators' thinking. What ethical frameworks could we suggest to propose in secular colleges and companies?
Okay, I'll allow each of the respondents. We just have a couple minutes, but starting with Dr. Pencina, if you'd like to respond to this, where we are at the discussion.
I think they've ethical frameworks are critical, and I want to connect some of the conversations. First of all, I very much agree with Dr. Pfau's pessimistic view that the governments will not be able to handle it, right? We've gone too far, and as humanity ceded way too much authority to large corporations that are to a large extent in charge of what's happening. So we have to think about alternative frameworks. Now, I also caution against AI being the scapegoat here, because that's been happening, right? And you can say data and technology in general definitely contributed, but it's us humans, our desire for convenience, that ceded that authority. It is our choice to get the iPhone and the new iPhone and the new iPhone and put the pictures and all the data and engage in Facebook, right? We've made these companies what they are, not the technology. I will argue with Dr. Elmore saying that he disagrees about the AI being ethically neutral. I don't want it to give it more authority because it makes it this mysterious, powerful thing that it's very hard to deal with, right? It's kind of an example I want to use. We served alcohol at this dinner. We cannot argue that alcohol is evil because it can lead to abuse. Similarly, AI can definitely lead to abuse, but inherently, it's a bunch of math formulas, right? It's how we humans use it. We can use it ontologically and beyond, but we are making the decisions. So I want to warn against the temptation that it's something coming from another world imposed on us, and here we are, poor humans, having to deal with it, right? It used to be, we can argue there still is, in our control, but let's not give up our agency. I think I very much agree with Dr. Wirzba about the lack of investment in the right ethical frameworks, right? I think it's the imbalance of investment in development, right? Silicon Valley and others putting tons of money and nobody wanting to fund anything related to governance, evaluation, and ethics. That is a huge, huge problem. What I believe in terms of the right governance, I want to get back to the principle of subsidiarity that Dr. Schertz talked about the workshop participants this morning, right? Local governance, that's what we need. Like, health system decides which algorithms to use. A family decides if their children will have access to social media, right? Let's not give it up. Let's not wait for government to do it. It's on us.
Okay. Dr. Elmore, Dr. Wirzba, a final thought.
Okay.
Oh, final.
No,
Thomas gets the final thought.
So it's there. I'll say two things. First to continue our gentle debate. I go back to the earliest line from the poem I closed with. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. This includes every element forming material substrates in computer systems. It includes every conceivable way that the order of the world exists, right? So it's not right. I guess what I don't want to say is that is evil. And I also don't want to say that AI is evil, right? But I think that all things participate in the good. However, it is very, this is your point, Michael, that we defect, right? We defect from the good. And I think then how we use the stuff frames how we see stuff. So the example of an iPhone is good because it frames a certain way of inhabiting reality. And that way of inhabiting reality is, obviously it's mixed, but also driven by profit motives and, large corporations that desire control over our habits. So it's tricky and it's difficult to tease it out, which is why I think a turn to Augustine and the idea of being in a mixed context is helpful. Okay, let me say one last thing then about ethical frameworks. I think that so common currency in AI ethics is to turn to principles, right? Which are intermediate terms that sort of help people come together and build consensus. I view them as provisional. They might not be the same as what some people might want by turning to a natural law framework. However, there are elements that resonate, right? So when you think about fairness and equity, for example, that's a widespread kind of accepted ideal or principle, which for me is a satisfying thing, especially given my desire to see how it might cohere with natural law frameworks. I'll leave it there. But to say there are pragmatic moves you need to make when you're actually thinking in applied ethics and actually trying to work with people to get this stuff done.
I don't know if there's a shared ethical framework, and I'll leave it at there. I don't want Augustine to have the last word. I want Hopkins to have the last word. I want us to reflect on your point that the world is charged with the grandeur of God. I think we live in an Anthropocene world, which means the world is charged with the hubris of humans. But there is still the dearest freshness deep down things. And I think the work ahead that's crucial is to figure out where is the dearest deep freshness down things in your world, in yourself, in your neighbor, in your place, in your community. Identify it, cherish it, and protect it. That's the best we can do.
Perfect. This program was festgestellt. It was set for 8. We went 5 minutes overtime. I apologize for that, but I think there's still time to thank our entire panel for this fascinating discussion.